This is Reaganism, a podcast dedicated to exploring where the Reagan movement lives today. I'm Roger Zakheim, your host, director of the Ronald Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C.
On this episode of Reaganism, Roger sits down with Matthew Waxman, who serves as an adjunct senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. They discuss the ongoing Israel-Hamas war, the rise of anti-Semitism on America's college campuses, and the impact of social media on the national conversation surrounding anti-Semitism and the war against Hamas.
Matt Waxman, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Roger.
Matt, you are the professor of law at Columbia Law School and chair of their national security law program, a national security official during the Bush 43 administration. Of course, we're here today to talk about anti-Semitism on college campuses. But before we get there, would love to actually have you outline a bit of your kind of area of academic expertise, which is really about the laws of war and how that should inform our understanding of the Gaza war. And of course, that conflict has really been what's triggered so much of the drama on campuses and this real spike in anti-Semitism. So let's start really from the academic perch where you're speaking with us today at Columbia Law School and give us some context on the laws of war and its relevance here.
Sure. Thanks, Roger. So the October 7th attacks was unquestionably an unspeakable war crime. The massacring of civilians, the taking of hostages, rape, abducting and killing babies, committed with a sadistic savagery, a genocidal intent. And it's not just the October 7th attacks. Thousands of rockets Hamas has fired indiscriminately at populated areas of Israel during that and since then. So Israel is justified in waging a self-defensive war on a massive scale. If international law didn't allow states to defend themselves in situations like this, the law would collapse. And the core idea then of the laws of war is a balance between military necessity or the need to wage war effectively and humanitarian considerations. And that, I think, really boils down to two basic principles to keep in mind, and you're going to hear a lot about them, but they're often misapplied by media and commentators. The first is the principle of distinction, right? You can't deliberately target civilians. You must aim at military targets. And that doesn't mean that civilians will knowingly and incidentally be killed. You can't deliberately target them. The second principle is proportionality. This is not a comparison of body counts as some sort of eye for an eye. The principle here is that the expected civilian suffering of an operation can't be excessive to the expected military gain. And we're talking here about trying to apply these rules to urban combat in one of the most densely populated places on Earth, against an enemy that has embedded itself underground beneath the civilian population and that commits the war crime after war crime of using human shields to deliberately put civilians in harm's way. Let me make one last point, which is that even as Israel wages a defensive war against an enemy that is grotesquely inhumane, we who support Israel must not lose our own humanity. And among other things, that means feeling and expressing sorrow, empathy for those many civilians in Gaza who are innocent and who are now suffering on a very large scale.
So a lot to discuss there and unpack there, Matt. We'll take a couple of minutes just so we understand some of the points you made and the language you use. And then we'll turn to the environment on campus, which seems to be another battlefield. And I use that word advisedly. It really seems to be part of the battlefield here. But as you described Hamas's vicious, cruel, barbaric attacks on October 7th, use the language of war crimes, use the language of genocidal intent, and the indiscriminate firing of rockets on Israeli sovereign territory, which, as a date of this recording, is still happening, even with
That's right.
Israel's bombardment of Gaza and their attempt to root out Hamas from Gaza. Talk to us about that language, that the conduct is war crimes, that the intent is genocidal, and that part of that is this indiscriminate attack, meaning not distinguishing between a legitimate, air quotes there, military target versus civilian populations. It really goes to the core of not just Hamas's strategy, ideology, their supporters as well, which would seem to have a different construct of what they think is moral right.
That's right. We're talking about a war here between a rule of law country and a terrorist enemy that deliberately tries to pervert the law for its own gain. We're talking about a country, a state, military, the IDF, that tries to avoid collateral damage, tries to avoid civilian harm, though the law recognizes that in high intensity combat operations, especially in a densely populated area, tragically, there is going to be a lot of human suffering, especially against an enemy that deliberately puts civilians, its own civilians, in harm's way, using human shields, burying its own military resources, its own fighters directly beneath civilian sites. And so we're talking about an asymmetry in the war in so many ways. None of this, though, absolves Israel from conducting its own operations in accordance with the law. That's important for a rule of law society. That's important morally. It's also important strategically. And we'll probably come back to some of these issues as we go along. The last thing I would just say here is that the principles I outlined, the basic principles of the law of armed conflict, are often misstated. I think there's often a rush to judgment, condemning Israel before all the facts are in, often with the comfortable benefit of hindsight. And I think generally, Israel is often held to a higher standard than other advanced militaries. And here it's against an enemy that has, and I'll say it again, unquestionably committed war crimes of the worst kind.
One last point, and then we'll move into the environment on college campuses, both the one where you are and your observations across the United States. But you're emphasizing proportionality, which you're right, gets bandied about a lot by the commentariat, news organizations. The language you used earlier was, it can't be excessive to the military gain. Right. And here, just as here we are over a month since the war broke out on October 7th, rockets are still flying into Israel. Right. So if the military objective is to suppress, at the very least, Hamas rockets from landing into Israeli sovereign territory, that is not done. So it'd be hard to argue somehow that, to me, just very narrowly on that point alone, that somehow, that it's excessive to the military gain, which is seeking, which is to have its civilian population not victim to these indiscriminate rockets. Is that one application of it, or am I thinking about it the wrong way?
No, I think you're getting it right. As I said from the beginning, the laws of war try to balance military necessity and humanitarian interests. And there's a proportionality calculus to be made right up front. Is a war of this kind necessary and proportionate to the threat that Israel is facing? And that threat is very severe. We're talking about the worst kind of violence perpetrated with, as I said before, with genocidal intent, a clear intention by the enemy to try to continue that campaign of violence, whether it's committing massacres, whether it's firing rockets indiscriminately, making parts of Israel, even with defensive lines reestablished, making large parts of Israel uninhabited. And in conducting individual strikes, Israel the IDF needs to take into account the military necessity of taking out particular targets. And as I said before, it's easy in hindsight to judge differently the proportionality calculations that are made by the IDF. And I actually think reasonable people can disagree. Getting those balances right is hard. There are certain balances that are easy to call. To destroy an entire apartment complex to take out a single sniper, for example, would clearly be disproportionate. But even in making and even in evaluating some of these strikes where there is room for disagreement, there is room, I would say, for criticism of Israel. There are different people who will make, especially in hindsight, different proportionality judgments, but we are talking still about a military force that has a very robust and well-practiced system for complying with the international law of armed conflict, or the laws of war, against an enemy that operates with a perverted effort, a perverted strategy that deliberately puts civilians in harm's way.
Absolutely. I mean, it seeks to expose and exploit the seams of the law of armed conflict and international law to their gain, and that's clearly the rationale for having command and control headquarters underneath a hospital, for example, right? Or transferring terrorist units in ambulances. I mean, this is the sort of thing where it absolutely provokes and uses this is the shield of civilians to accomplish its military objectives, making it almost impossible for Israel either to realize this military objective or to win what is the public relations battle.
And I'll just add, war is awful, and the international law rules are designed to make it less awful, but it's still going to be awful.
Well, you have the war that broke out on October 7th, and we've just had having a discussion about kind of the doctrines and elements of law of armed conflict, and certainly as it relates to proportionality. Matt, you said, okay, reasonable people can disagree. October 7th, shortly after, on college campuses, including Columbia University, where you teach, actually where I attended as an undergraduate, it didn't seem to be an environment where there was, this kind of thoughtful exchange of different views, but rather a full-on embrace in defense of Hamas's massacre. And here I'm not talking about just a marginal element of students, perhaps, but it seemed to be wider spread than that, and not just one or two members of Columbia's faculty that somehow have a construct of any Israeli being a colonizer, in which case they're subhuman and then could be legitimately a victim of a massacre, but actually a defense of Hamas and ran deeper across institution that emerged. This, of course, led many, including my view, that this wasn't just anti-Israel, this is anti-Semitic. And the type of outlook that would warrant and support genocide of Jews on par with being a Nazi and a Nazi sympathizer. Matt, am I characterizing the response and the environment, both at the campus where you teach, but also across the country, accurately, or is there some nuance I'm missing?
Well, I don't want to generalize across all campuses, and I don't want to generalize across all groups. But I'll say the situation is bad. It's very bad. We know from organizations like the Anti-Defamation League that nationwide, since October 7th, incidents of anti-Semitism, attacks, bigoted speech, vile anti-Semitic graffiti, rallies, they're all up by very large margins. And university campuses are seeing the same thing. None of this is to take away from Islamophobia and other forms of hatred as well. But Jewish students on campuses, Israeli students, are facing the kind of vile and offensive expression and acts that I have not seen before in my 16 years on the faculty here. And since the October 7th attack, there were individual cases of faculty members across the country, individual ones outright celebrating the Hamas attacks. These kinds of celebrations are obviously vile and disgusting, and it's shocking that any of these people would hold faculty positions. But much more generally, across the country, we've seen coalitions of campus organizations put out statements. Again, they're not all the same, but many shared some similar themes and language. These included not just groups dedicated to Palestinian rights, but other groups that are generally dedicated to social justice or promoting the rights of other vulnerable or historically disadvantaged groups. And some groups even that had nothing to do, even remotely, with Israel, nothing to do with Palestinians or Muslims or the Middle East. And they've tended to adopt, they've been joined in a common narrative of oppressed versus oppressors. And among the messages that we see quite consistently advanced across the country is things like that Israel bears 100% responsibility for the pogroms that we saw on November 7th, and claims that these are the somehow natural consequences of Israeli policies, that are obviously a matter of considerable debate. I'll pause there for a moment, but I'd like to try to address some of those points directly.
Yeah, I definitely want to get into that, particularly the letter and the faculty reaction signed by more than 100 Columbia faculty, really adopting this outlook and quote unquote contextualizing the attacks of October 7th, and really referring to the massacre that Hamas carried out on October 7th, which you rightly called the pogroms, as some sort of legitimate military action, given that context. But before we get there, Matt, I think it's important just for you to really parse the complicated subject, but enough for this conversation between free speech and hate speech, or free speech and anti-Semitic speech, because what I heard embedded in your last set of comments was, there's always been a place for free speech. Post, October 7th, it has crossed that line to something that is really beyond the pale for free speech. Maybe take a minute on that, and then we'll go into some of the specific arguments and the sort of language that shocked me, Columbia faculty signed up for.
Yeah, good. When it comes to free speech and the kind of anti-Semitic speech or hate speech that we've been hearing across the country, my own starting point is I'm a big believer in campus free speech. I think that students should be exposed to speech that makes them uncomfortable or even offends them in some instances. That's why they're at universities. In fact, I do worry that one possible outcome of this is that it's going to become even harder to have serious conversations about Israel on campus. And we need to have those serious conversations about what a just and lasting solution to Israeli-Palestinian issues are, who's responsible for the suffering in Gaza, questions like that are difficult and are uncomfortable. But I generally don't want university administrators or faculty trying to shut down certain expression, even if it offends. That's my general starting point. However, with freedom of expression comes responsibility. and students need to learn that too. And since the October 7th massacre, I called it a pogrom before. I think that's what it is. I've seen views expressed loudly and publicly on university campuses that, as you said, in some cases excuse Hamas's atrocities, basically saying it's Israel's fault, or using sort of euphemisms that seek to justify it, as well as some that outright celebrates or glorifies Hamas's attack, and not just an attack, but a barbaric massacre. And actually, I'd go even further and say, unlike Nazi war crimes, which obviously were on a vastly different scale, but a lot of those were meant to be kept quiet. This was all done wide open, in order to be broadcast. And so I'm finding it difficult to figure out what's the right way to handle widespread campus speech or statements excusing Hamas's atrocities, pinning all responsibility on Israel, because I'm worried about also chilling some legitimate speech. But I'll make a couple of points in addition to that. One, we are clearly seeing some egregious hypocrisy. Had there been a massacre of any other religious or ethnic or minority group like the one that Hamas committed, and those kind of statements that I just described, blaming the victims, came out within 48 hours, the administrative repercussions would have been swift, and they would have been punishing. Again, we need to be careful about going too far in banning or chilling legitimate criticism. And by the way, I'm critical of some policies of Israel. I'm worried, for example, of insufficient efforts to suppress settler violence. And these are things that should be discussed. They should be debated. But call it anti-Semitism, call it anything you want. Somehow it's okay on university campuses to treat and talk about the October 7th slaughter in a way that I doubt would be tolerated if the targets were a different group.
Matt, 1,000%. And something you hit on just a minute ago, again, we're with Matt Waxman, professor of law at Columbia Law School. He is the chair of the National Security Law Program at Columbia, an expert in the law of armed conflict. Matt, you made a point just a moment ago. This is all done in public. We think about so much of neo-Nazis in the United States. They really haven't had a place they could probably go in public, and when they did, it's a national outcry. I mean, think Charlottesville, right? This was a kind of widespread, people just condemning that sort of behavior, and had the drama with President Trump following that. But it was never something that anybody would have to argue that this is legitimate speech or appropriate conduct, or to contextualize the language of blood and soil. You just would never see that and do that in this country. Yet here we are on college campuses in particular. It's where you see it the most. Where this language of river to the sea, or legitimizing Hamas's massacre, or ripping down signs that say return hostages home, kidnapped, somehow is okay to, occur in the public square, in the public eye. I mean, it seems that we've just crossed a line here that in my lifetime I've never seen. And that seems to be so much of what this outcry is post-October 7th, particularly in the world of the academy and intellectuals, creating this space for it. I mean, is that a fair distinction? I mean, this is where when I heard you talk about the public space, that's what it meant to me, right? It seems to be okay.
One of the things that's pretty shocking about this is I think it's clear that there's been an anti-Semitism, a level of hostility to Israel that's been festering for a long time. And I got to say, I find it astonishing that some groups or organizations would see the October 7th attacks as the moment to raise their voices and celebrate or seek to justify this kind of attacks. They're looking to justify or excuse something that is unjustifiable and truly inexcusable and despicable in every possible way. You know, there are a lot of things here that can be debated. We can debate whether Israel's an apartheid state. We can debate whether Israel represses the Palestinian people. I welcome that debate. And I find myself, like I said, I find myself opposing some Israeli policies. But there should be no debate that October 7th was unquestionably a war crime of the most evil kind. Like I said, committed with genocidal intent and language pinning sole responsibility on Israel, language that seeks to, as you say, contextualize these acts in a way that seems to justify them, is an attempt to justify the unjustifiable in an offensive way. You know, one of the messages that I've heard so often is that this kind of monstrous terrorism is just what happens when a population is oppressed and doesn't have other outlets for opposition. And no, that's just empirically false. This isn't just what happens. This isn't just what happens. That's not the norm. That's not what can be expected in modern history. This is exceptionally barbaric. It's actually hard to think of modern parallels to this level of sheer sadism, and to compare that to more noble examples of resistance is preposterous. The only appropriate moral response is condemnation.
Well, that point of view, that the only appropriate moral response is condemnation, was certainly not the way some members of the Columbia faculty responded to October 7th. A widely publicized letter, as I referenced earlier, of 100, I think more, faculty members concerned about the protection of students protesting in favor of Palestine, using this Palestinians, using this language from the river to the sea, and legitimizing and justifying Hamas's attack, came from those who are teaching in the university. Has to be troubling, given what you just said. Probably surprising. I just love to get your take on that, and then we'll move on to what you and a few colleagues have done in response. And what I found so gutting was not that you had, as I mentioned before, just a faculty member take this position, but so many choosing to sign on, justifying, as you said earlier, justifying the unjustifiable.
Yeah, you know, let me just make a couple of points on that, and then we can talk about the letter that the sort of responsive letter that I and some colleagues drafted. First, however repugnant one might think that Israeli policies are, I find it morally warped that some organizations, some groups, including instructors who are dedicated to the rights of vulnerable groups, would not even acknowledge, let alone condemn, what is unambiguously a massacre, a pogrom perpetrated by an organization bent on the destruction of another people, and against a country that, for example, is the only place in the entire region that you could safely conduct a pride rally or march for reproductive rights. In addition, some of these statements, as well as tolerance of them, I think reflect some incredible ignorance of the history of the Jewish people, in particular, a history of attempts to exterminate it. That history teaches, for example, that the pogroms of the 19th and early 20th century, the Holocaust, and in some cases like those, the response of other countries, including, sadly, sometimes our own, was often this response of to the Jewish people, we don't want you either, right? Sorry, our country's full. So if you want to say that we need to look at Hamas's attacks, quote, in context, well, that's context too. And if you know something about that history, you understand why for Jews and Israelis, an exterminationist attack like we saw on October 7th is so utterly traumatic, and why statements like the ones that Israelis and Jewish members of our communities read from their peers just 48 hours after the attacks felt like the late 1930s and early 1940s again, of this idea of, no, we don't want you either.
Matt, part of what motivated, I believe, a response from you and a few colleagues, I'd love for you to outline what's in that letter and the arguments that were made. It's not very long. It's just clear. It has clarity, and it follows some of the points we've discussed earlier. But was the plight of students? As you were referencing before, the students on campus who feared for their security did not feel, and continue to fear for their security, did not feel that the administration was adequately protecting them, and what was going on other campuses, most notably the threats against Jewish students in Cornell, targeting them in their dining facility, students at Cooper Union barricaded in the library as they're being aggressively bullied and threatened by students supporting Hamas. I mean, this is absolutely reminiscent of the type of activism, anti-Semitic activism, that took place in European universities, about a century ago. And it's in that context, Matt, right, where not just the letter that some of 100 faculty members of Columbia signed, but also the plight of the students on campus that I think made, I guess I'm asking, motivated you to take some action with colleagues. Tell us about that, please.
Yeah, so maybe I can talk a little bit about what, from my own experience, my own observation, my own discussions, many Jewish and Israeli students are feeling on campus, and then we can come to the letter.
Yeah, please.
As I said before, the situation is bad on campuses. It's very bad. And what I'm about to say is, of course, not to take away from the idea that we need to be vigilant of Islamophobia, other bigoted actions and speech, conduct. Of course, we do. And I'll also say, my own law school, my own university administration has been working hard, urgently, to address some things like physical safety. To make sure, and that's really the most important thing right off the bat, right? Students need to feel safe coming to school and studying. I have had Jewish students tell me that they were afraid to come to class.
And we're not talking here about trigger warnings or conversations that might be uncomfortable because you're talking about, someone using the language of apartheid as it relates to Israel or Palestinian economic and political rights. You're talking about physical safety on campus because someone is wearing a kippah or a Jewish symbol and they don't feel safe.
Right. And, at my own university, I'll say that the administration at my own law school, at the university writ large, it is taking those kinds of things seriously, for which I'm grateful. They are taking actions on physical safety. They're taking actions on discipline, conveying the message that we need to watch very carefully for any kind of bigoted hate speech directed against Jewish or Israeli students, any bigoted or hateful acts directly against them, and those kinds of things need to be subjected to disciplinary processes, just like we would, or a university would combat other forms of bigotry. As I mentioned before, I spend a lot of time these days with Jewish students, Israeli students, and I don't want to overgeneralize. These are diverse groups with a wide range of opinions, wide range of experiences, but they feel betrayed for the reasons I said before. They feel hatefully targeted by their peers, and I don't blame them. I will, though, just mention two silver linings. These are very, very thin silver linings to a dark cloud, but they are nevertheless some small glints of silver. The first is that these events have brought together the Jewish community like I've never seen before on campus. Here at Columbia, we have, for example, a great Hillel chapter that is led by a very, very dedicated executive director who's also taking steps, as are the groups themselves, to make sure that students are well cared for. And I credit the administrations for taking some actions as well. All steps in the right direction. We'll need to see how it plays out, but certainly some steps in the right direction. And I hope that the bringing together of the Jewish community remains long lasting. The other thing I'll just say is that amid a lot of despicable behavior and expression on campus, I have also had some outreach from individual members of the community with whom I have no doubt we disagree on Israel issues. And those messages from certain individuals have been so kind, so caring, that they have brought tears to my eyes. And to those individuals, I'm very grateful.
Well, it's always good in these moments to have those cases of people shining through, though it seems to be certainly insufficient these days. But you felt you need to take your own action, Matt, right? That it was a moment where whatever the administration has done, whatever the community has done, you needed to respond, and a few of your colleagues needed to respond. What was that? And tell us about kind of what you're seeking to do. It seemed that you wanted to have an articulated message, actually clearly outlining what is, what context is, and where context doesn't really help at all. And that is, in matters of a war crime, I won't put words in your mouth. And second, to be a place where other faculty members at Columbia have a chance to sign on and be a part of. I mean, if you didn't agree with the other letter, there wasn't actually a place, I don't think, I wasn't aware of, where they could go. And what you did with a few colleagues created that space. So tell us about the letter and the response you've gotten from other faculty.
Yeah, so three great colleagues of mine and I drafted our own letter in response to statements that had been publicized that we found either offensive or deeply troubling. And again, we can talk about some of that substance as to why we felt that, but we really wanted to make 3 points. First, that at a great university like Columbia, really any university, there needs to be robust debate about complex and difficult issues. And that includes things like what a possible solution, if there is one, to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict might look like, who is to blame for the miserable conditions in Gaza, what the wisest strategy to deal with them might be. A university like ours needs to foster an environment where debate on these important issues can proceed, can happen without harassment, without intimidation. The second point we wanted to make is to express just sheer horror that anyone would certainly celebrate the monstrous attacks, but also seek to legitimize them with language like recontextualizing them or characterizing them as just a military action. And of course, as we say in the letter, we feel sorrow also for the civilians who are killed or are suffering in this war, and they're killed or suffering on a very, very large scale, and we all need to feel empathy. We need to feel sorrow for that, but we think it needs to be unconditionally condemned, and there should be no message that begins with anything other than just complete condemnation. And the third point that we wanted to make is one about treating anti-Semitism, treating speech about Israel or Jews needs to be treated the same way that other speech directed at other groups would be treated. Again, we oppose unconditionally bigoted comments or acts directed at Palestinian or Muslim students or any other group. But in the same way that the university defends other groups from this sort of disgusting conduct, it's essential to do the same for Jewish and Israeli students.
It seems to be a simple point, one that I would have thought shouldn't be controversial, but that was pre-October 7th thinking. What has been the response from other faculty members that were asked to sign on to this letter? Seems to be hundreds when I last looked at it. But Matt, as a professor of law, chair of the National Security Program, I think when you write or co-author of a note that makes these distinctions, it should carry a lot of weight. We'll talk about the Academy and Laws of War in just a minute. But what has been the response from faculty at Columbia University who had an opportunity, I believe, to sign on to the letter that you and a few colleagues crafted?
Yeah, so I'm very happy to report that it's received overwhelming support from other faculty members. Within a week, we had about 450, maybe more, signatures to that letter. I've received a lot of supportive comments and feedback from across the country, from people who I admire both inside and outside the academy. And my three other co-authors of that letter were recently appointed by the president of the university to chair a new task force on anti-Semitism. I see that as a positive step. We'll obviously need to see what comes out of it, but I do see that as at least a positive step in the meantime.
We're with Professor Matt Waxman, professor at Columbia Law School, chair of the National Security Law Program at Columbia. We're going to close out this conversation on law of war in Gaza, anti-Semitism on college campuses, with a basic question, which is, where is the Academy in the laws of war? Because if there was even a basic level of understanding and acceptance of the law of armed conflict, I would think perhaps not students, perhaps not the activists, but certainly the faculty would approach this differently. Is it just outright rejected intellectually? Are there pockets of kind of the liberal arts, where they just don't accept the construct that is international law and law of armed conflict? Where does it reside? How is your actual area of academic study viewed beyond the walls of a law school?
Yeah, especially being at a law school, I've been especially disappointed in some of the reaction I've heard from some colleagues, from some students. So let me make 2 points. One is a sort of a general point about academia and Israel, and the other is an even more general point about academia and the kind of thing that we're seeing in faculty hiring and curriculum. Actually, before I get to those points, let me make one other, which is, a lot of the letters, a lot of the statements that we've seen coming out from opponents, from critics of Israel, again, in the immediate aftermath of the October 7th atrocities, called for essentially university disengagement from Israel, from a cutting off of institutional ties with Israel. I think that's exactly the opposite of what ought to be done. I think these events show the need to strengthen those kinds of relationships. But in answer to your more direct question, I think we've seen a failure to adequately reject a moral or legal equivalency between those defending against terrorism and those perpetrating it, between a state whose commitment to law underpins its military operations and versus a terrorist group that openly defies the law, between the IDF that seeks to minimize civilian harm and terrorist groups that deliberately target civilians or perversely put their own civilians, the civilians they claim to be defending, protecting, in harm's way. And again, none of this is to say there isn't room for very legitimate debate and even criticism of Israeli conduct. None of this is to take away from the need to feel great empathy for the tremendous suffering going on in Gaza, but we need some moral clarity on those points. I'm stepping back even more generally.
Right.
I think we are also seeing some of the effects of, for example, an imbalance of faculty, an imbalance of university curriculum. The problem with the way, for example, the academy teaches about war and state power, just as examples. Not to make this all about my own area, but it's a good example. Universities have turned away from serious study of hard power, military power. And this is a big problem, not only for preparing students to understand the world around them, the world in which they're going to, we hope, emerge as leaders, but also if you believe, especially as I do, in peace through strength, then we're failing to train, again, the next generation of leaders. I feel like at law schools, or I observe at law schools, an especially acute problem because war is often seen as a sort of antithesis of law, that military power is seen as antithetical to the power of ideas. And remember what I said at the beginning about the law of armed conflict. It's about balancing military necessity with humanitarian interests, and law schools are overwhelmingly focused on the latter. And there's a problem if the balance doesn't go too far in favor of humanitarian interests. But there's also a huge problem if the law isn't sufficiently attentive to military needs. The law won't survive that. And so these are some general grievances I have with universities these days. There are some initiatives that are trying to turn this down. That are trying to turn this around, rather. Your institution, the Reagan Institute, does a lot of programming with universities. I work with the Alexander Hamilton Society, which is trying to, through chapters on campuses nationwide, to address these kinds of issues. I'm part of a multi-university effort, the America in the World Consortium, that supports scholarship in foreign affairs that's policy relevant and oriented towards maintaining American leadership in the world, and we need more of that.
Thanks, Matt, and couldn't agree with you more. It seems to me that when the academy abandons the law of armed conflict, doesn't recognize legitimate use of force versus a war crime, we're in a really bad place. And that's why I there was so much to cover in terms of anti-Semitism on campuses and response to the Hamas massacre in Israel on October 7th. But why I want to focus, when you think about the academy, is what faculty is and is not doing, what they are saying, and how we're responding, and grateful to you for your response. All right, we're going to move to the lightning round. We're with Professor Matt Waxman. Matt, this is where we get our favorite Reagan speech, Reagan quote, and book on President Reagan. Give us all three, two, or just one. What do you have?
Sure. President Reagan had important things to say about the United States as a haven for refugees. Early in his administration, he talked about a national responsibility, along with other countries, to welcome and resettle those who flee oppression. He, in his farewell address, talked about the same. And there have been times that the United States has shut its door to those fleeing persecution, and if it hadn't opened them, many of us now fighting anti-Semitism would not be alive today. And as for my favorite book, that's an easy one. Will Lynn-Bowden's, our friend Will Lynn-Bowden's masterpiece on Reagan and the Cold War, The Peacemaker.
Matt, thank you for being on the show. Look forward to staying in touch on this.
Thanks very much, Roger.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Reaganism. New episodes premiere weekly every Monday on YouTube and all podcast streaming platforms. If you like this episode, be sure to let us know and share with a friend.